They said blood is thicker than water. But tell me, what does blood mean when your own family disowns you for chasing your dreams? 12 years later, I showed up at my sister's graduation in a white suit, Rolls-Royce gleaming, cameras flashing. My father's jaw dropped, my mother cried, and I realized silence had been my loudest revenge all along. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The chandelier above our dining table cost more than most people's cars. $75,000 of Italian crystal, my father had announced when it was installed, like the price tag mattered more than the light it cast. I used to think that mattered, that the numbers and the names and the value of things defined their worth. That night, as my father's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, I realized it only mattered to him. The rest of us were just living in his museum. Richard Clarke sat at the head of the table, exactly where he'd sat for every dinner I could remember. The Los Angeles Herald spread before him like evidence at a trial, his reading glasses perched on his nose with theatrical precision. His silver hair was immaculate, every strand in place, styled the way men with power style their hair. When they want you to know, they pay attention to details. His navy suit was pressed to perfection, even at 7 in the evening, even at home, because my father never relaxed. Relaxation was for people who had nothing to prove. He looked at me the way you'd look at a stock that had just crashed, disappointed, furious, disgusted. All of it carefully controlled, because Richard Clarke never lost control in public, and dinner, even family dinner, was always a performance. Clarke heiress drops out of UCLA to work at a motel. He read aloud each word, deliberate, controlled, sharp. His voice had a particular quality when he was angry, like ice cracking under pressure. Care to explain this, Madison? I set down my fork carefully, the way he'd taught me when I was 6. Never scrape the plate, never make unnecessary noise, always be conscious of how you occupy space. The clink of silver on china echoed too loud in that cavernous room with its 16-foot ceilings and walls covered in abstract art, worth more than most people's houses. My mother, Evelyn, sat to his right in her usual spot, wearing a cream silk blouse that probably cost $3,000, and pearls that had belonged to my grandmother. Her hands were folded in her lap, manicured nails painted a tasteful nude. Her eyes fixed on her untouched salmon, with its perfect arrangement of asparagus and microgreens. She wouldn't look at me. She never looked at me when things got difficult. That was her particular talent, the ability to be present and absent simultaneously. Hannah, my baby sister, 17 and terrified, glanced between us like she was watching a car crash in slow motion. Her face was pale, her hands gripping her napkin under the table. I could see her knuckles white with tension. She wanted to help, wanted to say something, but she was smart enough to know that speaking would only redirect his attention to her. I didn't think it needed explanation, I said quietly. My voice didn't shake. I'd practiced this moment in my head for weeks, rehearsed 100 different versions of this conversation during sleepless nights in my UCLA dorm room, then later in the studio apartment I'd rented when I'd finally made the decision to leave. You were born into a legacy, my father continued, folding the newspaper with sharp, angry movements that made the paper crack like a whip. Each fold was precise, controlled, another way to demonstrate his mastery over his environment. The Clarke name has built half of Beverly Hills. Your grandfather started with nothing, Madison. Nothing. He came to this city with $200 and a work ethic that would kill most men today, and you're throwing it away to clean motel rooms. The irony of invoking my grandfather wasn't lost on me. Charles Clarke had started with nothing true, had built his fortune through grit and determination, through taking risks that terrified him, through doing exactly what I was trying to do now. But that narrative didn't fit my father's argument, so he ignored it. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm building something different. Different. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the laugh of a man who'd heard a joke so stupid it offended him. You want different? Different is for people who have no choice. You have everything, and you're choosing poverty. You're choosing to be ordinary. The word ordinary landed like a slap. In the Clarke household, ordinary was the worst thing you could be. Mediocre, common, forgettable. My father had spent his entire life running from the memory of his father's humble beginnings, building towers, that scraped the sky just to prove he'd climbed higher than anyone expected. "I want to build something real," I said, meeting his eyes across the expanse of mahogany table. "Something that's mine, not inherited, not handed to me because of a last name I didn't choose. Mine. Real." His voice rose now, the calm facade cracking like the wine glass he'd shattered the week before, in almost this exact same conversation. "This empire is real, Madison. These properties are real. The sweat and blood your grandfather put into this family is real. The fact that you'll inherit everything I've built is real. And you're spitting on all of it because you read some self-help book about finding yourself." I felt my mother's silence like a weight on my chest, heavy and suffocating. She could have said something. She could have asked him to lower his voice to listen, to see me as anything other than a disappointing investment. She could have reminded him that I was 22 years old, not a child, not a possession, not a line item in his portfolio. But she stayed quiet, her manicured nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks I'd see later when she finally looked at me. "Dad," Hannah whispered, her voice small and desperate. "Maybe we should just—" "Stay out of this, Hannah." He didn't even look at her, didn't acknowledge her existence beyond dismissing it. She flinched like he'd struck her. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound seemed to echo forever in that huge room. In that moment, standing there in my simple dress and my unchosen life, I felt like I was finally taking up space on my own terms. "If you walk away, Madison," my father said, his voice deadly calm again, controlled again, cold again, "you don't come back. The Clarke name is no longer yours. Do you understand what that means? No more trust fund, no more connections, no more safety net. You'll be nobody." I looked at him. Really looked at him. This man who had taught me to read financial reports before I could read chapter books, who had walked me through construction sites when I was 6 years old, showing me how foundations were poured, how steel beams were raised, how buildings rose from nothing but vision and will. Who had told me over and over that I was meant for greatness, that I was special, that I was going to do extraordinary things, but only the greatness he defined, only the extraordinary he approved. Only the things that served his vision of what the Clarke legacy should be. "I understand," I said. My heart was racing so fast I could feel it in my throat, but my voice came out steady. He picked up his wineglass, gripping it so hard his knuckles went white. For a moment I thought he might throw it. Instead, he slammed it down on the table. The stem snapped clean through with a sharp crack that made Hannah gasp. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth, like blood pooling around the broken crystal, staining everything it touched. Then I guess dinner's over. I turned and walked. My heels echoed against the marble floors, each step louder than the last, the sound bouncing off walls covered in expensive art and expensive memories. Behind me, I heard Hannah whisper my name, her voice breaking on the second syllable. I didn't turn around. If I'd seen her face, if I'd seen the tears I knew were streaming down her cheeks, I might have stayed, and staying would have killed me slowly, one expectation at a time, one disappointment at a time, one day at a time, until I forgot what it felt like to breathe. My room looked different that night as I packed. The 4-poster bed where I'd had nightmares about failing classes and dreams about building impossible things. The walk-in closet full of designer clothes I'd never chosen myself. Outfits picked by stylists for charity galas and business dinners, each one carefully selected to communicate success and breeding and Clarke family values. The desk, where I'd written business plans that my father had corrected in red ink, always finding something wrong, always pushing me toward his vision instead of mine. I took only what I needed. 2 suitcases, some clothes, the practical ones, jeans and t-shirts and sweaters that were mine, that I'd bought with my own money from summer jobs he'd never known about. A photo of Hannah and me at the beach when we were kids, before everything got complicated, before legacy became a cage and love became conditional. My laptop, my journals, the acceptance letter from UCLA that I'd been so proud of once. The house was silent when I walked out at midnight. No goodbyes from the doorway, no last-minute reprieve. No sound at all except my suitcase wheels on the marble and my own breathing fast and shallow and free. Just me, 2 suitcases, and the warm Los Angeles night air that smelled like jasmine and possibility. As I stood on the circular driveway waiting for the taxi I'd called, I looked back once. The mansion blazed with light, every window glowing, like it was showing off, like it was trying to remind me what I was leaving. The life I was supposed to want. The future I was supposed to accept. The person I was supposed to become. I thought I'd feel angry. I'd expected rage, the kind of burning fury that comes from rejection and betrayal. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. Lighter than I'd felt since I was a child, before I understood what the Clarke name meant, before I learned that love could be conditional and that family could be a prison with gilded bars. They thought I was angry. They were wrong. I was just done asking permission to exist. The Ocean View Inn was nothing like the properties my father built, where Clarke Development created gleaming towers with marble lobbies and obsequious doormen. The Ocean View Inn was honest about what it was, a place for people passing through a way station, for those who couldn't afford better or didn't want to. The neon sign flickered. Vacancy in pink and blue. Half the letters burned out, so it really read VANCE, which felt appropriate somehow. Paint peeled from the stucco walls in long strips, revealing decades of color choices underneath pink, then yellow, then green, then beige. The ocean wind rattled the windows at night with a persistence that sounded almost angry. The smell of salt and mildew hung in every corner, in every piece of carpet, in every curtain, permanent and honest. It was perfect. My room was on the second floor, number 237. Small, just a full-size bed with a sagging mattress, a dresser with a drawer that stuck, and a bathroom with questionable water pressure and tile grout that had seen better decades. Cheap floral curtains that didn't quite close, leaving a gap where streetlights streamed in all night. A heater that clanked like it was trying to escape every time it turned on, which it did at random intervals that made sleeping interesting. But when I lay in that bed the first night staring at the water-stained ceiling with its mysterious brown ring that looked vaguely like California, I smiled. The first real smile I'd had in months. This was mine. No one's name on the deed, but the owner's some corporation I'd never heard of. I was just a renter, just another person paying weekly rates in cash because I didn't have a credit card anymore. No legacy weighing down the walls, no expectations hiding in the corners, no one watching to see if I measured up to some impossible standard. I started at the front desk the next morning at 6. Ray, the owner, was already there. A gruff man in his 60s with kind eyes and zero patience for excuses. He showed me how to check guests in using a computer system from 1995, how to handle complaints without losing my temper, how to smile even when someone was screaming about the Wi-Fi being too slow to stream Netflix. The coffee from the vending machine in the lobby tasted like burned rubber mixed with regret, but I drank it anyway, grateful for the caffeine, even if it was terrible. It felt democratic somehow. Everyone who worked there drank the same awful coffee. No one got special treatment. No one got anything imported from Italy at $12 a cup. "You got hospitality experience?" Ray asked on day one, looking me over with sharp eyes that had probably seen every type of runaway rich kid and con artist who'd ever walked through his door. I lied, thinking of charity galas and business dinners where I'd schmoozed with developers and politicians. He looked at me over his reading glasses, saw straight through the lie, and shrugged like he'd heard worse. "You'll learn, or you'll quit. Most people quit by week 2. The ones who stay usually have nowhere else to go." I didn't quit. The work was repetitive and exhausting in ways I hadn't expected. Guests yelled about everything. The pillows were too soft. The pillows were too hard. The water pressure was too low. The water pressure was too high. The ocean was too loud. How could the ocean be too loud? They'd booked a motel called Ocean View Inn and were somehow surprised that they could hear the Pacific. I smiled through all of it upgraded rooms when I could apologized. Even when it wasn't my fault, learned that sometimes people just needed someone to listen to them complain. Ray taught me that. "They're not mad at you," he'd say. "They're mad at their lives. You're just the person in front of them." My hands got dry from cleaning products. I'd help housekeeping sometimes when they were short-staffed, scrubbing toilets and changing sheets. My manicured nails from my old life slowly growing out and breaking off until my hands looked like they belonged to someone who worked for a living. My feet ached from standing all day on linoleum floors. At night, I'd collapse on my lumpy mattress and listen to the Pacific wind howl like it was telling secrets to anyone who'd listen. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. 3 months in, everything changed. A woman walked through the door one Wednesday morning, and I knew immediately she didn't belong there. I'd gotten good at reading people, at knowing who was staying for a week versus who was just passing through for a night, at seeing who had money versus who was counting every dollar. This woman had money. Real money. Old money. The kind of money that didn't announce itself but didn't need to. She wore a cream suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, perfectly tailored to her frame. The kind of thing you can only get with multiple fittings, and a designer who knows your measurements by heart. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, not a strand out of place. Her heels clicked with purpose against the worn linoleum expensive Italian leather. Making sounds the floor had probably never heard before. Vivian Hayes. I'd learn her name later, would Google her, and discover she was a venture capitalist who'd made her fortune backing women-owned businesses when no one else would, who had a reputation for seeing potential in places other investors missed. But that morning she was just a woman who didn't belong in the Ocean View Inn, checking in like it was the Ritz-Carlton. She handed me a credit card without speaking. I processed it, gave her a key to room 304, our best room, which wasn't saying much. She took the key, nodded once, and walked toward the elevators without asking a single question about amenities, or checkout times, or where she could find the ice machine. I watched her go, wondering what brought someone like her to a place like this. The answer came an hour later. A guest stormed to the desk, his face, red veins visible in his temples, pointing at his bill with an accusatory finger, like the paper itself had betrayed him. "This is highway robbery. I was told this place had free Wi-Fi." "It does, sir," I said, calmly, pulling up his account on the ancient computer that took 30 seconds to load each screen. "But the premium sports package requires an additional—" "I don't care about packages. This is false advertising. I want my money back. I want it now. I'm going to write a review so bad, you people will go out of business." Other guests were watching now. The lobby had gone quiet. Ray was in the back office, probably hoping I'd handle it, probably testing me like he tested everyone. I took a deep breath, smiled the smile I'd learned at charity galas, and looked at the man like he was the most important person in the world. "I can see this has been frustrating for you, Mr. Alvarez. Let me upgrade you to a suite with complimentary premium access. No charge. And I'll personally ensure your stay is comfortable. Would that work?" He blinked, his anger deflating like a punctured tire. "You can do that?" "I can do that." He left, happy. Even thanked me. Even said he'd revise his review. Crisis averted. I went back to sorting mail, my heart still racing from the confrontation, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "You handled that well." I looked up. Vivian Hayes stood at the counter watching me with sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to see right through my Ocean View Inn uniform to whatever was underneath. "Thank you," I said, trying to sound professional. "Just part of the job." "No," she said quietly, leaning against the counter like she had all the time in the world. "Most people would have called security or let him shout himself out. You solved the problem. You made him feel heard. That's a skill most people never learn." She pulled out a business card from a leather card holder, slid it across the counter with one perfectly manicured finger. The card was simple, elegant, cream-colored, with black text. Hayes Capital Partners. A phone number, nothing else. No email, no website. Just the implication that if you needed to reach her, you'd figure out how. "When you're ready to stop surviving and start building, call me." I picked up the card. Felt the weight of it. Expensive cardstock, the kind that costs $5 per card. "I don't understand." She smiled, the kind of smile that held 1,000 secrets. "You will." Then she walked away, heels clicking, leaving me holding a piece of cardstock that felt heavier than it should, like it was made of possibility instead of paper. I kept that card in my wallet. Didn't call. Not yet. I told myself I wasn't ready, that I needed to prove I could make it on my own without anyone's help, that accepting her offer would somehow invalidate what I was trying to do. Winter in Santa Monica was cold and lonely. The tourists thinned out, replaced by locals and long-term residents, people who lived in the margins the way I did now. The motel filled with interesting characters. A retired teacher writing a novel, a musician between gigs, a woman running from an ex-husband, People with stories they didn't share unless you earned their trust. Ray paid me in cash every week, asked no questions about my past, didn't care that I'd shown up with expensive luggage and no job history. "Everyone's running from something," he said once. "Long as you show up and do the work, I don't care what you're running from." At night, after my shift, I'd walk to the beach. The Pacific stretched out forever, dark and churning, infinite and indifferent. I'd sit on the cold sand with my journal, watching waves crash against the shore with a rhythm that felt eternal. I wrote everything down, ideas, plans, dreams that felt ridiculous but wouldn't let go. I wanted to build something different, a place where people didn't come to show off wealth but to find peace, where luxury meant quiet, not excess, where staff weren't invisible servants but valued craftspeople who took pride in their work, where every detail mattered because it contributed to the experience of restoration, of finding yourself again. I called it the lighthouse in my notes, a place that guided people home, to themselves, to peace, to whatever they'd lost along the way. It sounded ridiculous when I read it back. A girl with 2 suitcases and a front desk job at a run-down motel, dreaming about resorts. Who did I think I was? What made me think I could build something when I'd walked away from everything that could have made it possible? But the dream didn't let go. It grew stronger. Every night I'd add more details, floor plans, design concepts, mission statements, values, a business model based on sustainability and authenticity, and treating everyone with dignity. Freedom didn't feel like wings. It felt like walking into the dark without a map, hoping the ground would hold, hoping you'd find your way before you got lost. The cafe in Westwood had good light and terrible coffee, which seemed to be the standard for Los Angeles cafes that priced their lattes at $6. I sat by the window on a Thursday afternoon, scanning job listings in the LA Times, circling anything that looked promising. Assistant manager positions at hotels in Santa Monica, event coordinator roles at convention centers, regional hospitality director for a chain of boutique hotels. Anything that wasn't cleaning rooms at midnight or dealing with angry guests who thought shouting was an acceptable form of communication. I'd been at the Ocean View Inn for a year now. 12 months of learning how to survive on minimum wage and tips how to stretch every dollar until it screamed how to smile when I wanted to cry. It had taught me everything about hospitality and nothing about my future. I was 23 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, eating ramen, more nights than I wanted to admit. The cafe door opened, with a familiar chime. I didn't look up, too focused on an advertisement for an assistant manager position in Pasadena that actually sounded interesting. Benefits, growth potential, a salary that would let me finally afford my own apartment instead of room 237 at a motel that smelled like mildew and broken dreams. Still at the motel. I looked up. Vivian Hayes stood beside my table, same cream suit, same knowing smile. A year had passed since I'd seen her, but she looked exactly the same. Timeless, polished, unshakable. The kind of woman who'd probably looked 45 since she was 30, and would still look 45 when she was 70. Still surviving. I said, closing the newspaper and wishing I'd ordered something more impressive than black coffee in a chipped mug. "May I?" She gestured to the empty chair across from me. I nodded, suddenly aware of how I must look. My work clothes simple and cheap. My hair pulled back in a ponytail because I couldn't afford regular haircuts anymore. My hands rough and dry from cleaning products, nails short and unpolished. A far cry from the polished UCLA student I'd been when she'd first seen me. She sat with the grace of someone who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals in rooms far nicer than this, ordered nothing from the hovering waiter, and placed a leather folder on the table between us. "Open it," she said. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled the folder closer. Inside were blueprints. Professional architectural drawings on expensive paper, financial projections in neat columns, market analysis with graphs and demographic data, and a logo simple and clean, a lighthouse silhouetted against a circular moon. The Lighthouse Resort. My breath caught in my throat. My hands froze on the pages. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know potential when I see it," Vivian said, leaning back in her chair, completely calm, like she handed people their dreams in leather folders every day. "You left that journal on the front desk once. Last month. Ray showed it to me. I hope you don't mind." Heat flooded my face, embarrassment mixing with something else. Violation, no. She wasn't mocking me. She was taking me seriously in a way no one had in a year. That was private. It was brilliant. She leaned forward now, her expression serious, intense. "You understand something most people in hospitality never grasp. Luxury isn't about thread count or marble countertops. It's about making people feel seen, about creating space for them to remember who they are underneath all the noise. I stared at the blueprints. Carmel by the sea, a small property, 20 rooms, ocean views, minimalist design, sustainable materials. Every detail I'd written about in that stupid journal, now rendered in professional architectural drawings that must have cost thousands of dollars. I want to fund it, Madison. $500,000. You run it, I invest. We split profits 60-40 in your favor. The world tilted. $500,000. The kind of money my father threw around without blinking, now sitting on the table, like a dare, like a test, like an opportunity that felt too good to be real. Why me? I whispered, afraid to speak louder. Afraid the offer would disappear if I acknowledged it too directly. Because I've been watching you for a year. She counted off on her fingers, each point delivered with precision. I've seen you handle chaos without flinching. I've seen you solve problems no one trained you to solve. I've seen you treat every guest with dignity, even the ones who treat you like you're invisible. I've seen you study hospitality books during your breaks. I've seen you ask Ray questions about operations and finances and guest retention. She paused, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. That's rarer than money, Madison. Much rarer. I can find 1,000 people with business degrees and 0 people with your instincts. You know how to make people feel safe. In a world this harsh that's worth investing in, what if I fail? The question came out small, vulnerable, nothing like the confidence I'd been trying to project. She smiled, but it was sad this time, like she'd had this conversation before, and knew how it ended. Then I lose money. You lose belief. Which is more expensive? I stared at the blueprints. The financial projections showed conservative estimates of revenue, realistic occupancy rates, a 3-year timeline to profitability. Everything was detailed, researched possible. Someone had spent real time on this. Vivian had spent real time on this. On me. On my half-formed ideas scribbled in a drugstore journal. My hand shook as I reached for the pen. She offered a heavy fountain pen that probably cost more than I made in a week. You're sure? I asked one more time, needing her to say it again, needing to believe this was real. I'm never sure, Vivian said honestly. Every investment is a risk. Every bet is a gamble. But I trust my instincts. And my instincts say you're worth the risk. You walked away from everything certain to find something real. That takes courage. And courage, in my experience, is a better predictor of success than anything else. I signed. My signature looked small and uncertain next to hers, which was bold and confident, the signature of a woman who'd done this 100 times, who'd bet on underdogs, and watched them become champions. For the first time in my life, someone bet on me without trying to own me. The next 6 months were a blur of construction dust and possibility. Carmel by the sea welcomed us with foggy mornings and skeptical locals who'd seen developers come and go, who didn't trust people from Los Angeles with their fancy ideas and promises. The property had been a run-down bed and breakfast, unloved and forgotten, paint peeling and plumbing failing, and dreams abandoned by previous owners who'd given up. We gutted it, rebuilt it from the foundation up. I worked alongside the crew in jeans and paint-stained shirts, learning how to hammer nails without hitting my thumb, how to sand wood until it was smooth as glass, how to choose fixtures that were beautiful but durable. The crew laughed when I got things wrong. Patient men in their 50s and 60s who'd been building things since before I was born. They taught me when I asked, respected, that I wasn't afraid to get dirty, didn't care that I was Richard Clarke's daughter, because I never told them. Here I was, just Madison, the woman with wild ideas and determination, the boss who brought them coffee and listened to their suggestions and valued their expertise. Vivian visited once a month, walking the construction site in expensive heels that gathered dust, beautiful shoes ruined by drywall powder and wood shavings. She never complained, just asked questions, offered suggestions, trusted me to figure things out. What's the guest experience from parking lot to room? She'd ask. What story does each space tell? Are we creating beauty or just avoiding ugliness? Her questions made me think deeper, push harder, care more about every detail. Opening night came in October, just as the fog rolled in thick and dreamlike. We'd hung flickering lanterns along the pathways, installed benches where guests could sit and listen to the ocean. The smell of salt air mixed with fresh paint and new beginnings. 20 rooms, each one designed to feel like a refuge. White linens, local art, windows that framed the Pacific like paintings, sustainable toiletries, books instead of televisions, silence instead of music, space to breathe instead of amenities to consume. Our first guests were Margaret and Henry Porter, a retired couple from Sacramento celebrating their 40th anniversary. Henry had surprised Margaret with the reservation after finding us online, drawn to the promise of peace and simplicity. She cried when she saw the ocean view from their room. Actually cried. "I haven't felt this calm in 20 years, she said, holding my hands, her eyes wet with gratitude. He hugged me like I was family and whispered, "You've built something special here, something the world needs more of." 2 days later, their review appeared on every travel site, along with photos they'd taken. Sunrise from their balcony, the walking path to the beach, their breakfast on the patio simple and perfect. The review was titled, "This isn't a hotel, it's a homecoming." They wrote, "The lighthouse isn't luxury in the traditional sense. There's no marble lobby or obsequious staff, but it's something better. It's peace. It's the feeling of exhaling after holding your breath for years. Madison Clarke didn't build a hotel. She built a home for people who forgot what home feels like." Bookings tripled overnight. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Travel bloggers found us. A photographer from Sunset magazine called wanting to do a feature on the anti-resort revolution. I sat alone on the porch one evening a week later, reading the Sunset article on my laptop, barely able to process what I was seeing. The headline called it, "A New Kind of Luxury." They'd interviewed Margaret Porter extensively, quoted her saying I'd redefined what it means to take care of people. Tears mixed with the sea wind on my face. Not sad tears, not happy tears exactly. Something else. Something like relief, like vindication, like proof that I'd been right to walk away, right to bet on myself, right to believe that there was another way to define success. I called Vivian that night. "Thank you," I said when she answered. "For what?" She asked, though I knew she knew, for seeing me when no one else did. "Madison," she said softly, "I didn't see you. I just recognized you. There's a difference. You were already this person. You just needed permission to become her." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, watching stars appear over the Pacific, feeling like I'd finally found the ground underneath my feet. Success doesn't need to scream. It just needs to arrive. The years between 2016 and 2020 moved like a wave, gathering strength, building momentum with each success, each new property, each validation that what I'd built wasn't just luck, but something sustainable and real. By 29, I was no longer the runaway girl sleeping in room 237 of a motel that smelled like mildew. I was Madison Clarke, CEO of the Lighthouse Collection. A woman who'd turned $500,000 into $50 million, who'd built a small empire based on a radical idea that luxury could mean peace instead of excess. The Lighthouse in Carmel became the first of many. Maui in 2017, a property nestled in rainforest, with floor-to-ceiling windows and outdoor showers, and silence so complete you could hear your own thoughts. San Diego in 2018 converted from an old beach cottage into 12 rooms of minimalist beauty. Monterey in 2019. Santa Barbara in 2020. Each property small, never more than 25 rooms. Each one intentional, built with the same philosophy, sustainable materials. Local partnerships, staff paid living wages with benefits and respect. We sourced food, locally used. Solar power captured rainwater. Every decision filtered through the question, does this serve peace or excess? The business magazines loved me. Forbes, Fortune Inc., Entrepreneur, they all wanted to tell my story. The rags to riches narrative Americans couldn't resist. From motel clerk to millionaire CEO, one headline screamed. The heiress who chose poverty and found fortune, said another. The truth was more complicated than their headlines, but I'd learned that truth doesn't sell as well as simple narratives. Vivian remained my anchor through it all, the steady presence when everything else felt chaotic. She came to every opening, every board meeting, every crisis. She never took credit, never demanded attention, never asked for recognition. Just showed up, offered wisdom, asked the right questions, and disappeared again like smoke. "You're doing it wrong," she'd say sometimes when I got too focused on growth instead of quality, when I started looking at expansion opportunities that didn't align with our values. "You're doing it perfectly," she'd say other times when I doubted myself, when imposter syndrome crept in during dark nights, when I wondered if I deserved any of this. She was never wrong. One afternoon in early 2020, a journalist from Forbes interviewed me at the San Diego property. Tyler Chen, young guy, probably fresh out of journalism school, trying too hard to find the angle that would make his article stand out from the dozens already written about me. We sat on the patio, overlooking the Pacific, the ocean, providing a dramatic backdrop for the photographer who kept adjusting her equipment and asking me to move into better light. "Do you owe your success to your family?" Tyler asked, pen poised over his notepad, eyes watching me carefully for any reaction. I'd been asked this question 100 times. The Clarke name still carried weight in California real estate circles. People assumed I'd had help connections, family money greasing the wheels. The assumption followed me everywhere, the suspicion that my success wasn't entirely my own. "I owe it to being underestimated," I said, the answer arriving fully formed, honest, in a way I hadn't expected. He blinked, stopped writing. "Could you expand on that? When people expect you to fail, you have nothing to lose. That's freedom. You can take risks, try unconventional approaches, build something different because you're not worried about maintaining a reputation or living up to expectations. When people expect you to succeed, you have everything to lose. That's a cage. Every choice is about preservation instead of creation. I chose freedom." He wrote frantically, sensing he'd gotten something real. "But your family built Clarke Development. Surely their experience, their knowledge, taught me how to build things I'd never want to stay in," I interrupted gently. "My father builds monuments to excess. I build places where people can exhale. Those are completely different philosophies. If anything, watching his approach taught me exactly what not to do." The quote went viral within hours of the article publishing. "Silence is power" trended on Twitter for 3 days. Young women tagged me in posts about leaving toxic families, starting over, building something from nothing. Entrepreneurs shared the quote with captions about choosing authenticity over approval. I read every single comment, staying up late into the night, scrolling through thousands of responses. Some made me cry. Stories of daughters estranged from fathers, sons rejected by mothers, people who'd walked away from everything certain to find something real. Others made me furious. Trolls claiming I was privileged, that I'd had it easy, that walking away with 2 suitcases and a UCLA dropout status wasn't exactly hardship. All of them reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, that somewhere right now a girl was sitting at a dinner table being told she wasn't good enough, and maybe my story would give her permission to walk away, to save herself, to believe that she could survive without approval. But late at night, when the office was empty and the ocean was just a distant whisper through closed windows, I still looked at old photos on my phone, photos I'd saved before leaving, before burning those bridges, before becoming someone new. Hannah's 16th birthday party, her smile bright and innocent, not yet touched by the weight of family expectations. My mother's forced smile at my high school graduation, her eyes sad even as she clapped. My father's hand on my shoulder at my UCLA acceptance celebration, heavy with expectation. His fingers digging in just slightly too hard. I told myself I didn't miss them. Most days I believed it. The missing had gotten quieter over the years, less acute, more like a dull ache I'd learned to carry, but it never completely disappeared. One night in early 2020, just before the world changed in ways none of us expected, I dreamed about the dinner table, the broken wine glass, my father's voice cutting through the silence. "The Clarke name is no longer yours." I woke up breathless, sweating in my $400 sheets in my penthouse apartment overlooking the San Diego harbor. Success hadn't erased the wound. It had just given me better bandages, prettier scars, a more comfortable place to bleed. The email from Forbes came on a Tuesday morning in March. Subject line, cover story opportunity, self-made women issue. They wanted to feature me as one of America's self-made women under 40. The headline would read, "The self-made heiress who rebuilt her own name." I stared at the email for 20 minutes, my coffee growing cold, my toast untouched. My finger hovered over the reply button, moving closer, then pulling back uncertain. Self-made. Was I Vivian's money had built the first lighthouse? My UCLA education, even unfinished, had given me tools most people never got. My family's name, even rejected, still opened doors I didn't see opening. The Clarke name was supposed to be my curse, but maybe it had been a gift I didn't want to acknowledge. But I'd walked away. That had to count for something. I'd chosen poverty over inheritance, uncertainty over security, freedom over approval. Those were real choices with real consequences. I hit reply and said yes. The photographer came 2 weeks later with a full crew lights and reflectors and assistants carrying equipment. They wanted shots of me looking powerful, looking successful, looking like I'd won whatever battle I'd been fighting. I stood in front of the Lighthouse Collection headquarters in my best suit. Armani in navy blue, the kind of suit my father would have approved of. I smiled the smile I'd practiced in mirrors, the one that looked confident, without being aggressive, successful without being threatening, approachable without being weak. They photographed me for 4 hours, hundreds of shots, me standing and sitting and looking thoughtful and looking determined. By the end, I felt like a product being packaged, a story reduced to a set of poses that would sell magazines. When the issue came out in May, I looked at the cover and barely recognized myself. The woman staring back was polished, confident, untouchable. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was professional. Her smile suggested she'd never doubted herself for a single moment. The caption read, Madison Clarke, 29, CEO, 87M, net worth, built it all alone. Not quite alone, I thought, looking at the framed photo of Vivian on my desk taken at the Carmel opening, both of us laughing at something neither of us could remember now. But close enough to make the story work, close enough to inspire other people, close enough to prove that walking away had been the right choice, even if some nights I still wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed. The storm came the way storms do in Los Angeles, fast, and without apology, arriving when you thought the skies were clear and the future was certain. I was in the San Diego office on a Tuesday afternoon in late 2024, reviewing plans for our 7th property in Big Sur, when Jason Moore knocked on my door with his laptop. He looked pale, which was unusual for Jason. The man had nerves of steel, a dry sense of humor that kept our team sane, and the ability to stay calm in any crisis. Seeing him shaken made my stomach drop before he even spoke. "You need to see this," he said, setting the laptop on my desk, his hands not quite steady. The headline hit me like cold water. Clarke development under SEC scrutiny. Federal investigation opened. I read the article twice, my heart rate climbing with each paragraph. Richard Clarke, my father, was being investigated for financial irregularities. Offshore accounts in Dubai and the Cayman Islands. Questionable transfers totaling millions. Investor funds potentially misused for personal expenses. Shell companies with names like Pacific Vista Holdings and Clearwater Development Companies that existed only on paper. The article was careful, full of allegedly, and sources say, and according to documents reviewed the language of journalists trying not to get sued while still telling the truth. "They're saying it's preliminary," Jason said carefully, watching my face for a reaction. "But the SEC doesn't open investigations for nothing, Madison. If they're looking, they've found something." I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, stared at the San Diego skyline, stretched outside my window. All glass and steel and possibility. A city my father had helped build his properties, dotting the landscape like claims staked on conquered territory. "He'll deny it," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "He always does. He'll call it a witch hunt, or a misunderstanding, or competitors trying to destroy him. He'll fight it until there's nothing left to fight with." "Probably," Jason agreed. "But Madison, there's more. You should see this before someone else shows you." He handed me his phone already pulled up to a social media post. My cousin Marissa's verified account, her profile picture professional, and polished her bio listing her as PR director at Clarke Development. The headline made my stomach turn. Madison Clarke inheriting success by rebranding her family name. An insider perspective. I read the post, each word landing like a small cut. She painted me as a fraud, someone who'd leveraged family connections while pretending to be self-made. She called the Lighthouse Collection repackaged Clarke Development values with better marketing and a younger face. She suggested I'd only succeeded because investors knew the Clarke name because doors opened for me that would stay closed for others. Any reasonable investigation into Madison Clarke's so-called self-made success would reveal extensive family connections, early seed funding likely sourced from family wealth, and a brand that trades on the very name she claims to have rejected. Marissa wrote, "It's good marketing, I'll give her that, but let's call it what it is, privilege with better PR." The post had been shared thousands of times. Screenshots flooded Twitter and Instagram. Within hours, fake self-made was trending. Journalists I'd worked with, people who'd written positive profiles about me, started asking for comments. My publicist called 3 times. My silence apparently proved I had something to hide. "We need to respond," Jason said firmly. "You can't let this stand. Every minute you stay quiet, more people believe it. We need a statement, interviews, proof that Vivian's investment wasn't family money. We need to control this narrative before it controls us." "Let them talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "They can't hear me anyway." "Madison." "No." I stood up, walked to the window, pressed my palm against the glass. The cool surface grounded me. You know what happens when you defend yourself. You legitimize the accusation. You give it oxygen. You turn gossip into news. Right now it's just noise on social media. If I respond, it becomes a story. It gets picked up by real publications. It becomes part of my narrative forever. Staying silent makes you look guilty. Responding makes me look defensive. There's no good choice here, Jason. Either I look guilty or I look defensive. I'd rather look guilty and maintain my dignity than look defensive and lose it. Jason sighed, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "Vivian's going to disagree with you." He was right. Vivian called that evening while I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the San Diego harbor, watching boats return to port as the sun set orange and violent. "I saw the article," she said without preamble, her voice tight with concern. "And Marissa's post. I'm calling to tell you that silence is power, but timing is control. Don't mistake one for the other." "I'm not responding to lies." I said, my jaw tight. "I'm not asking you to respond. I'm asking you to be strategic. There's a difference between dignified silence and being silenced, between choosing not to speak and having your voice taken from you." I didn't answer. Just watched the harbor lights begin to flicker on one by one, like stars falling into water. "Madison," Vivian said softly, "I know what you're doing. You're proving you're above it, that you don't need to defend yourself because the truth speaks for itself. But sometimes being above it means they get to write your story, and their story becomes the truth, regardless of what actually happened. Let them write it." I said, my voice harder than I intended. "I'll just keep building mine. I'll let my work speak louder than their words. Results over rhetoric. Isn't that what you taught me? I taught you that results matter, but I also taught you that narrative shapes reality. You can't control what people think, but you can influence it. Silence can be power, but it can also be surrender. You need to know which one you're choosing." We hung up, and I sat in the dark, watching city lights flicker like uncertain stars. Like maybe I'd made the wrong choice, like maybe silence was just another word for cowardice. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that while I stayed silent, someone else was talking. Someone I'd never expected. Someone who'd stayed quiet for even longer than I had. Somewhere in Los Angeles, in a downtown office building I'd never visited, investigative journalist Emily Ross was opening an encrypted email that had arrived anonymously through a secure portal. Files attached, dozens of them. Names, dates, account numbers. Offshore transfers linked to Clarke Development. Wire routing numbers. Bank statements. Board meeting minutes. Evidence of systematic fraud stretching back nearly a decade. At the bottom of the email, typed in plain text, a single line. "Check H. Clarke. She knows everything." Emily stared at the name, her heart racing with the particular adrenaline that comes when you know you've found something big. Hannah Clarke, Richard Clarke's youngest daughter. The quiet one. The good one. The daughter who'd stayed. The story was about to change in ways I couldn't predict, in ways that would make my silence look like strategy instead of cowardice, that would prove that sometimes the best revenge isn't responding, but simply waiting for the truth to emerge on its own. Hannah had always been careful. Even as a little girl, she'd colored inside the lines, with meticulous precision, followed the rules without question, made herself small enough to avoid our father's attention. While I fought and questioned and eventually left, Hannah stayed. She thought staying meant safety, that obedience would protect her, that being good would earn her love instead of just tolerance. She was wrong. We both were. But it took her longer to learn it. At 28, Hannah worked in the finance department at Clarke Development, tucked away in a corner office on the 14th floor with a view of downtown Los Angeles, and a salary that paid for a nice apartment in Silver Lake. Good job, decent salary close to family. On paper, it looked like success. In reality, she was slowly drowning in the gap between what she knew and what she was supposed to pretend she didn't. It started with small details that didn't quite add up. Wire transfers that didn't match their descriptions. Invoices for properties that didn't exist or hadn't been built yet. Numbers that shifted between quarterly reports like they were hiding. Budget items labeled consultant fees that went to companies with no websites, no employees, no presence beyond a post office box in Delaware. She told herself she was imagining it. Our father had built this company from nothing. He was demanding yes. Controlling, absolutely. Ruthless in business, that was his reputation. But dishonest. That seemed impossible. Richard Clarke prided himself on his reputation. On the Clarke name, meaning quality and integrity. He wouldn't risk that. Would he? Then she found the Dubai Fund. Late one Thursday evening in September 2024. Searching for quarterly reports to prepare for a board meeting, she clicked the wrong folder on the shared server. Or maybe it was the right folder. Maybe some part of her had been looking for proof of what she already suspected. Inside were documents she wasn't supposed to see. Documents that hadn't been scrubbed from the server yet, hadn't been buried in the layers of corporate architecture designed to hide things in plain sight. Shell companies with names like Horizon Pacific Development and Sunset Equity Partners. Offshore accounts in Dubai and the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. Investor money disappearing into accounts with names that meant nothing transferred through so many entities it was impossible to trace without charts and timelines. Loans that existed only on paper investments that never materialized properties, purchased at inflated prices from companies our father secretly owned. And signatures, his signatures, over and over authorizing transfers that bypassed every rule and regulation, every safeguard designed to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. His handwriting bold and confident approving transactions that stole from people who'd trusted him with their life savings. Hannah sat at her desk, hand over her mouth, trying not to be sick, her mind racing through implications and consequences, and the sudden, terrible understanding that everything she'd believed about her life was built on a foundation of lies. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't aggressive accounting or creative financial strategies. This was systematic, deliberate, criminal. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, in her Silver Lake apartment, staring at the ceiling, listening to sirens wail in the distance, thinking about all the times our father had praised her for being sensible, for staying, for not causing trouble like Madison, for being the good daughter who understood family loyalty. She thought about what staying had cost her, the relationships she'd never pursued because they wouldn't meet family standards, the career opportunities she'd turned down because leaving Clarke Development would have disappointed him. The parts of herself she'd buried to be the daughter he wanted instead of the person she was. She thought about me 12 years ago walking out of that mansion with 2 suitcases and more courage than Hannah had ever believed possible. I'd been right. About everything. About him. About the cost of staying. About the price of approval. The next day, her hands shaking so badly, it took 3 tries Hannah copied everything onto a flash drive. Thousands of files. Spreadsheets, wire transfers, board, minutes, emails, contracts, everything she could find that documented the systematic theft of millions of dollars from people who'd trusted the Clarke name. Then she sent them to 2 people. Emily Ross, an investigative journalist known for exposing corporate fraud, whose expose on the Theranos scandal had won awards and destroyed careers. And Noah Blake, a lawyer who'd once worked for our father before leaving under mysterious circumstances, who everyone at Clarke Development whispered about, but no one discussed openly. The email was anonymous, sent through an encrypted portal, untraceable. Just facts, dates, evidence. No explanation, no plea for justice, no dramatic confession, just the truth. Finally, after years of being buried, Noah Blake called me 3 days later. I was in a board meeting reviewing expansion plans for our 8th property when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I normally would have ignored it, but something made me excuse myself and answer. "Ms. Clarke, my name is Noah Blake. I'm an attorney specializing in securities fraud. I'm calling because we're reopening an SEC investigation into Clarke Development. I need to know if the name Hannah Clarke means anything to you." The world stopped. The sounds from the conference room faded. My vision narrowed to a single point. "She's my sister," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "She sent us files, extensive documentation of systematic fraud dating back nearly a decade. Your father's been moving investor money through offshore accounts, falsifying quarterly reports, hiding losses through shell companies. We have wire transfers, forged invoices, emails showing intent. Hannah documented all of it. She gave us everything we needed to build a case that could send him to prison for 20 years. I sat down on the floor of the hallway outside the conference room, my legs simply refusing to hold me anymore. My back against the wall, my phone pressed to my ear, my breath coming short and fast. Hannah, my baby sister, the good daughter, the obedient one, the girl who'd stayed silent when I left, who'd chosen loyalty over honesty, who'd believed that family meant protecting each other's secrets. She'd found the courage I'd thought she'd never have. "She sent them anonymously." Noah continued, his voice gentle now, understanding that he'd just changed my entire understanding of my family. "But we traced the source. Digital forensics, IP addresses. We know it was her. She's going to be asked to testify when this goes to trial. I wanted to give you a heads up before this becomes public. You've built something clean, Ms. Clarke. You got out before this started. You deserve to know the truth before everyone else does." "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why are you telling me you don't owe me anything?" "Because 12 years ago, when you walked away, I thought you were a spoiled rich girl throwing a tantrum. I'm calling to tell you I was wrong. You saw what he was before any of us did. You had the strength to leave when the rest of us stayed. That deserves respect, and a warning about what's coming." After we hung up, I sat in that hallway for an hour, not moving, barely breathing. Jason found me eventually, crouched beside me with concern in his eyes, asking if I was okay. I wasn't, but I would be. Hannah had stayed. The good daughter. The obedient one. The sister I'd thought had chosen him over me, loyalty over justice, comfort over truth. And she'd found the courage to speak when it mattered most, when her voice could actually change things, when her silence had become unbearable. Sometimes karma doesn't arrive in thunder. It moves quietly like paperwork, like evidence compiled in the dark, like a sister finally choosing herself over the man who'd never chosen either of us. The SEC investigation unfolded slowly at first, then all at once. Subpoenas arrived at Clarke Development offices like an invasion. Court orders, frozen accounts, lawyers scrambling, leaked emails showing up on news sites with redacted names that everyone knew anyway. Emily Ross published her first article 3 weeks after receiving Hannah's files. The headline, "Clarke Development Under Federal Investigation. Allegations of Systematic Investor Fraud." The article was careful, meticulously researched, full of allegedly, and according to documents and sources close to the investigation. But it was damning nonetheless. It laid out a pattern of deception stretching back to 2015, millions of dollars vanishing into offshore accounts. Investors misled about property values, and return rates, quarterly reports, falsified to hide losses. Clarke Development's stock plummeted 40% in a single day. Investors started pulling out, demanding audits, filing lawsuits. News vans camped outside the headquarters, reporters doing live shots in front of the building my father had designed himself, the one with his name etched into the marble facade. And I watched it all from San Diego, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, which would have been petty and small. Not sadness, which would have suggested I still cared about him, instead of just mourning what might have been. Something in between. Relief, maybe. That the truth was finally coming out, even if it hurt. That the man who'd built his empire on lies was finally being held accountable. That my decision to walk away 12 years ago had been vindicated in the most painful way possible. I read Emily's second article on a quiet Thursday morning, standing on my balcony with coffee growing cold in my hand. The headline, "Clarke Empire Under Federal Lens, How One Employee Exposed a Decade of Fraud." They didn't name Hannah. Not yet. Legal protections for whistleblowers. But I knew. Anyone who knew our family would know. The good daughter had become the brave daughter. The quiet one had found her voice. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that I somehow knew was her. I'm sorry I waited so long, H. I stared at those words for a long time, watching the morning sun paint the harbor gold, thinking about courage and timing and the different ways people find their strength. Then I replied, my fingers shaking. You didn't wait. You picked the right moment. I'm proud of you. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally. Thank you. That means everything. It wasn't forgiveness. We still had miles to go before we could call ourselves sisters again, before we could rebuild what 12 years of silence had broken. But it was a start. And sometimes a start is all you need. Summer in Los Angeles hit like a fever dream, temperatures climbing into the 90s, the air thick with heat and tension, and the particular energy that comes when powerful people fall spectacularly. The news vans multiplied outside Clarke Development headquarters, like a biblical plague turning the entire block into a media circus. Reporters camped on the sidewalk with their camera crews, satellite trucks blocking traffic journalists shouting questions at anyone who walked out of the building. The security guards looked exhausted, overwhelmed, unprepared for this level of scrutiny. I watched the live broadcast from my San Diego office, unable to look away, even though every frame felt like witnessing a car crash. My father emerged from a black sedan at exactly 9 a.m., his timing perfect as always, his PR instincts still sharp even as his empire crumbled. He was immaculate in his navy suit, the one he wore for important meetings and court appearances, and moments when image mattered more than truth. His silver hair caught the morning sunlight. His face showed no emotion, that particular expression I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. Control, always control. Never let them see you sweat, or bleed, or doubt yourself. The reporters surged forward like a wave, microphones thrust in his face, cameras flashing so constantly it looked like strobes. Mr. Clarke, did you embezzle investor funds? Mr. Clarke, will you be stepping down as CEO? Mr. Clarke, what do you say to the families who lost their retirement savings? Mr. Clarke, is your daughter Hannah cooperating with federal investigators? He paused at the top of the steps, and I saw him make a calculation. He could ignore them, walk straight inside like they didn't exist. Or he could address them, control the narrative, for one more news cycle show the world that Richard Clarke didn't bow to pressure. He chose control, always control. He turned to face the cameras, that cold smile I remembered so well spreading across his face. The smile that never reached his eyes, the smile that meant he was about to destroy someone and wanted them to know it was coming. Gentlemen, ladies, he said, his voice carrying over the chaos with practiced ease. I've been building this city for 40 years. I've created thousands of jobs, built hundreds of properties, contributed millions to this community. And now, because one disgruntled employee made baseless accusations, the vultures circle. He gestured at the cameras with disdain. I built half this city. I don't answer to gossip. Then he walked inside, leaving the reporters shouting after him like gulls chasing scraps, his back straight, his head high, every inch the powerful man refusing to be brought low by mere allegations. But I'd seen something the cameras probably missed. A tremor in his hand as he'd gripped the railing. A tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. The small signs that the armor was cracking that control was becoming performance. Jason stood behind me in my office watching the same footage, his arms crossed. You knew this was coming, didn't you? I didn't turn around, couldn't stop watching the screen. He taught me that every empire has cracks, that nothing is permanent, that success is just organized chaos held together by will and reputation. I just learned how to survive when it collapses. Inside the Clarke Development boardroom, I imagined the scene playing out. Executives panicking, some already updating their resumes. Others calculating whether their loyalty would be rewarded or punished. Lawyers whispering about subpoenas and settlements and plea deals. My father sitting at the head of the table, where he'd always sat, still pretending he was in control. Still believing his name was armor enough to deflect federal prosecutors. He'd taught me that belief. That the Clarke name was unbreakable. That success meant never admitting weakness, never showing fear, never bending to pressure from lesser people. That if you projected strength long enough, eventually it became real. He'd been wrong. Strength wasn't projection. It was the ability to admit mistakes, to change, to recognize when what you were building was hurting people. He'd never learned that lesson, and now it would destroy him. The FBI raid came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't watching television when it happened, was actually in a meeting with architects discussing our Big Sur property, but Jason burst into the conference room with his laptop. "Turn on Channel 7, he said, his voice tight. I did, and there it was, live coverage of federal agents flooding into Clarke Development like an occupying army. They wore FBI windbreakers, carried boxes, and computer equipment moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. Agents escorted employees out of the building, some crying, others on their phones calling lawyers, all of them looking lost and frightened. Then the cameras caught him. My father, flanked by 3 lawyers in expensive suits, being escorted out of his own building by federal agents. Not in handcuffs, not yet, but the implication was clear. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was an arrest without the spectacle. His face had changed. The control was gone. The mask had slipped. He looked older suddenly, smaller somehow, his jaw tight with rage or fear. Or both. His silver hair disheveled, his navy suit rumpled. The polished businessman replaced by a man who'd just realized he'd lost everything. The cameras followed him to a waiting car, zoomed in on his face as agents guided him into the back seat. His eyes were wide, unfocused. For just a moment, he looked like what he was, a 70-year-old man who'd built his identity on power and was watching it evaporate in real time. At home in Beverly Hills, my mother watched the same footage. I imagined her in that big house where we'd once had family dinners, sitting in the living room with its Italian chandelier and abstract art and memories of better times. Her hands would be trembling as she watched the life she'd built crumble on national television. The woman who'd stayed silent when I'd left, who'd chosen his side because it seemed safer, who'd believed that loyalty to family meant loyalty to him regardless of what he'd done. Now she was learning what I'd known all along. There are no safe sides, just choices and their consequences. You can't protect yourself by staying quiet. Sometimes silence is just another word for complicity. I turned off the TV, walked out to my balcony. The San Diego skyline glittered in the afternoon light, and beyond it, the Pacific stretched forever, indifferent and eternal. The same ocean that had been here before Clarke Development existed, and would be here long after it was forgotten. He called me a disgrace, I said to no one, my voice quiet but steady. The world just called him accountable. Jason appeared in the doorway holding 2 glasses of wine from the bottle we kept in the office for celebrations, or catastrophes, whichever came first. He handed me one without speaking, understanding that sometimes the moment doesn't need words. We stood together, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky, in shades of orange and pink and purple that artists try and fail to capture. "Do you feel vindicated?" Jason asked finally, his voice careful. I thought about that question, turned the word over in my mind, like a stone, examining it from every angle. Vindicated. Proven right. Justified in my choices. The satisfaction of watching someone who'd hurt you get what they deserved. "No," I said slowly. "I feel tired." "That's fair." And sad, not for him. For what could have been if he'd been different. If he'd chosen integrity over image, if he'd valued people over profit, if he'd loved his family more than his empire. Also fair. We drank in silence, letting the ocean breeze carry the smell of salt and possibility. The eternal smell of the Pacific reminding us that this too would pass, that everything eventually becomes history. "I didn't destroy him," I said softly, more to myself than to Jason. "I just stopped protecting him. I walked away before I could become complicit, before his choices became my choices, before I was too deep to see the truth." The difference mattered. At least to me, I hadn't sought revenge, hadn't plotted his downfall, hadn't fed information to prosecutors or celebrated his suffering. I'd simply removed myself from his orbit and built something clean while he built something corrupt. And now the world was seeing the difference. That night, alone in my apartment, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize but somehow knew I should answer. "Madison?" My mother's voice sounded older than I remembered, smaller somehow, stripped of the careful social polish she'd always maintained. "Mom, I'm sorry to call without warning." A pause, the sound of someone gathering courage. I needed to hear your voice, to tell you that you were right about everything, about him, about leaving, about the cost of staying silent. I sat down on my couch, suddenly exhausted. I'm sorry you're going through this. Don't be. Her voice was firmer now, something like strength underneath the trembling. For the first time in 40 years, I can breathe. For the first time, I'm not afraid of what he'll say or do if I speak the truth. The cage is open, Madison. I'm just sorry it took this long to realize I was in one. We talked for an hour, tentative and careful. Two women who'd loved the same man in different ways, and both been hurt by him. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was honest. And honesty was something we'd never had before. After we hung up, I stood on my balcony and watched the San Diego lights flicker like uncertain stars. Like maybe the ending I'd expected wasn't the ending I was getting. Like maybe some stories are more complicated than revenge or justice or simple vindication. Like maybe healing looks different than we imagine it will. My mother's op-ed appeared in the Los Angeles Times on a Tuesday morning in early 2025, and the world shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. I almost missed it. I was at the gym when Jason texted me a link with a one-word message. Wow. I stopped mid-run on the treadmill, my heart already racing from exercise, and clicked the link with sweaty fingers. The headline read, "When Silence Hurts a Mother's Confession" by Madison Clarke. I got off the treadmill, ignoring the irritated person waiting for it, and read standing in the corner of the gym, oblivious to everything around me except the words on my phone screen. She wrote about choices, about how she'd stayed quiet when I'd left because speaking up meant choosing sides, and she'd thought neutrality was love. How she'd watched my father tear into me, that last dinner, watched him slam down his wine glass hard enough to break it. Watched me walk away and said nothing, because she'd believed it would blow over. That families always forgave that time would heal. What silence had wounded. She wrote about shame, about realizing too late that silence wasn't protection, it was complicity. That every time she'd said nothing while he berated me, criticized me, controlled me, she'd been saying everything. That mothers who claim neutrality when their children are being hurt aren't protecting peace, they're enabling war. I told myself I was keeping the family together, she wrote. What I was really doing was enabling a man who'd mistaken control for love, who'd confused obedience with respect, who'd built an empire on the same foundation. He'd built our family. Fear masquerading as loyalty. She wrote about the investigation, about discovering the extent of his fraud, about understanding that the man she'd married 40 years ago had been lying to everyone, including her. About the luxury she'd enjoyed being funded by stolen money, about the life she'd lived, being purchased with other people's retirement savings. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she continued. I'm stating facts. I enabled him by staying quiet. I benefited from his crimes by spending the money. I hurt my daughter by choosing him over her when she needed me most. Those are simple truths. They don't deserve sympathy or understanding. They deserve acknowledgement and accountability. The article went viral within hours. By noon, it was being shared across every platform. By evening, it was the most read piece on the LA Times website. By the next day, national news was covering it. The comments section became a confessional. Thousands of people sharing their own stories of silence and its cost. Mothers apologizing to daughters they'd failed to protect. Daughters forgiving parents who'd finally found courage. People recognizing themselves in my mother's words, seeing their own families reflected in her painful honesty. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Friends sending the link. Journalists asking for comment. Vivian calling to check if I was okay. My publicist suggesting we leverage this moment for positive press. I ignored them all and read the last paragraph again, standing in that gym corner with tears running down my face, not caring who saw. To my daughter, Madison, who walked away when I should have walked with her, you were right. About everything. About him, about the cost of staying, about the price of silence. I wish I'd been brave enough to tell you that 12 years ago. I'm trying to be brave enough now. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I'd forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I see you now. I see your courage. I see your strength. I see the woman you became without any help from me, and I'm so proud of you it hurts to breathe. I called her that afternoon, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I'd deleted years ago but still remembered. Madison. She answered on the first ring, her voice hopeful and terrified simultaneously. I read it. I said, "I'm sorry I took so long to say it publicly. I should have said it to you first, to your face, in private. But I'm a coward who needed accountability to find courage. I needed the world watching to finally tell the truth. You wrote it. That took courage." She laughed, but it sounded like crying. Too little, too late. 20 years too late. 12 years too late. But better than never, I suppose. Much better than never. We sat in silence for a moment, the phone line humming with 12 years of unspoken things, thousands of words we'd never said, finally finding space to exist. "He's not doing well," she said finally, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Your father. The lawyers say the evidence is overwhelming. He might go to prison for 20 years. He's 70 years old, Madison. He might die in prison." "I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it, not for him exactly, but for her. For the life she'd built that was crumbling now. For the dreams she'd had that were turning to dust. For the person she'd believed she'd married, who turned out to be someone else entirely. "Don't be," she said, her voice stronger now, something like peace underneath the pain. "I'm not anymore. For the first time in 40 years, I'm not afraid of saying the wrong thing, or disappointing him, or failing to meet his standards. For the first time, I can breathe without worrying about how it sounds. The cage is open." Madison. I'm just learning how to use my wings. 3 days later, Hannah called. "I sent those files," she said without preamble, her voice shaking but determined. "You probably already know. Everyone probably knows. But I needed to tell you myself. I needed you to hear it from me." I stood on my balcony watching sunset paint the ocean gold and orange and pink colors so beautiful they hurt. "I know," I said gently. "I'm sorry I waited so long. I should have." "Hannah," I interrupted softly. "You did what I couldn't. You stayed, and you still found courage. That's harder than leaving ever was. Leaving is running away from a burning building. Staying and putting out the fire, that takes a different kind of strength." I heard her crying on the other end, soft and broken sounds, like something inside her was finally releasing pressure that had been building for years. "I looked up to you my whole life," she said through tears. "I thought you were so brave walking away. I wanted to be like you, but I was terrified of being alone the way you were, of having nothing, of starting over, so I stayed and hated myself for staying. Every day for 12 years I hated myself a little more for not being brave like you. You weren't alone. You were strategic, and when it mattered, when your voice could actually change things, you spoke. That's not cowardice, Hannah. That's wisdom. I want to see you," she said. "If that's okay. I know it's been years and I don't deserve—" "When and where?" I asked, not letting her finish the self-flagellation. Really, you're my sister. That never changed even when we didn't talk." She took a breath, and I heard her gathering courage. "Stanford. There's an entrepreneurship forum next month. They want to honor you for your contributions to sustainable hospitality. For building something ethical in an industry that usually isn't. I'm on the board that nominated you." My heart stopped. Stanford, where I'd once been a business student before dropping out, where I'd walked away from everything my father had planned for me, where I'd first started dreaming about something different. "You nominated me," I whispered. "You deserve to be recognized, not as Richard Clarke's daughter, not as someone who escaped, but as Madison Clarke, entrepreneur, innovator, the woman who built something real and meaningful, as yourself." I closed my eyes, the ocean wind carrying salt and memory, the eternal Pacific, reminding me that everything eventually comes full circle. "Okay," I said. "I'll come." "Madison." "Yeah. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we gave you every reason to." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about family and forgiveness, and the strange paths that lead us back to each other. Thinking about how sometimes the people who hurt you most are also the people trying hardest to love you. They just don't know how. Thinking about grace and second chances, and whether some wounds ever fully heal, or if we just learn to carry them better. Vivian called that night like she always did, when I needed her most. Like she had some sixth sense for when I was processing something big. "I heard," she said simply, "Stanford. You know everything, don't you? I make it my business to know. She paused, and I heard her smile. You're not going to prove them wrong, Madison. You're going to remind them what grace looks like, what success built on integrity looks like, what happens when someone chooses themselves without becoming selfish. What if I'm not ready? The question came out small, vulnerable. You've been ready since the day you walked out that door. You just haven't realized it yet. You've spent 12 years building proof that you were right. Now you get to stand in front of them and simply exist. No explanations, no justifications, no defense. Just you, successful and whole and thriving, letting them see what they missed. I looked at the invitation that had arrived by email that afternoon. Stanford University, honorary title, national recognition. A ceremony attended by hundreds of people, including the family I'd walked away from 12 years ago. Vivian, I said softly. Yes, what if they see me and still think I failed? What if they look at everything I've built and still believe their way was better? She laughed, warm and knowing and full of the wisdom that comes from living long enough to watch the world change. Then they're blind, and that's their problem, not yours. You didn't build the Lighthouse Collection for them. You built it for every person who needed permission to walk away from what they were supposed to want and build what they actually needed. You built it for yourself, and that's enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and second-guessing of confidence and doubt, cycling through me like weather patterns I couldn't predict or control. Jason thought I was insane for caring so much about one event. I'd attended dozens of ceremonies, accepted numerous awards, given countless speeches to audiences far larger than Stanford would provide. But I couldn't explain to him why this felt different, why this mattered in a way nothing else had. It's just a ceremony, he said one afternoon, watching me review seating charts for the 5th time, obsessing over details that probably didn't matter. It's not just a ceremony, I said, moving a name from row 3 to row 7, then moving it back. It's closure. It's validation. It's walking back into the place I left and showing them I didn't just survive. I thrived. He still didn't understand. How could he? He hadn't spent 12 years proving something to people who'd written him off as a failure, who'd told him the only path to success was the one they'd laid out for him, who'd loved him conditionally, and then withdrew that love when he stopped meeting their conditions. The guest list was a who's who of California entrepreneurship. Corporate sponsors, Stanford Alumni University Press business leaders who'd built empires and wanted to network with other empire builders, and one row front and center reserved simply for the Clarke family. I stared at those 3 words longer than I should have, wondering who would actually show up. My mother, probably. She'd said she wanted to see me, wanted to support me publicly as some kind of penance for not supporting me privately. Hannah, definitely. She was on the board that had nominated me, would probably be speaking, my father. That was the question that kept me awake at night. He was out on bail awaiting trial, his movements restricted, but not eliminated. He could come if he wanted. Would he? Would he walk into Stanford and watch me receive recognition for building something honest while his empire of lies collapsed? Would his ego let him stay away? Or would his need to maintain appearances force him to attend? I didn't know which scenario scared me more. Are you bringing security? Jason asked one afternoon, half joking, watching me make yet another revision to my speech. 2 bodyguards and a Rolls-Royce, I said without looking up. He laughed, then realized I was serious. You're actually doing the Rolls-Royce. If I'm going to walk back into my past, I'll do it in style. If I'm going to face my family after 12 years, I'll do it from a position of undeniable success. Let them see exactly what I built without them. That's very dramatic. I'm aware. 12 years of silence for one moment of peace. For one afternoon of being seen on my terms instead of theirs. It was worth the theatrics. Vivian visited the week before the ceremony, appearing at my office unannounced, the way she sometimes did, materializing like a fairy godmother when I needed guidance most. She brought a white pearl suit jacket, beautifully tailored, the kind of thing that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It caught the light like captured moonlight, elegant without being ostentatious, powerful without being aggressive. Wear this, she said, handing it to me like a blessing. You've earned it. Wear something that reflects light. You've spent 12 years building something bright and good. Let them see it. I held the jacket like it might burn me, like it carried more weight than fabric should. It's too much. Nothing about you has ever been too much, Madison. You've just spent too long listening to people who were too little, people who measured worth by obedience instead of character, who confused silence with respect, who built their identities on making others small. I tried on the jacket. It fit perfectly like it had been made for me, which it probably had. Vivian was nothing if not thorough. It felt like armor, like wings, like proof that I'd become someone worth being. You'll know when to look up. Hannah texted me the night before the ceremony. Cryptic, but I understood. She was trying to tell me she'd be there, that she'd stand up for me when it mattered, that she'd claim me as her sister publicly, consequences be damned. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tried writing a speech attempting to capture everything I wanted to say to them, to the family I'd lost, to the university I'd left, to the person I'd been, and the person I'd become. But everything sounded wrong. Too angry, or too grateful, or too careful. Too focused on them instead of me. Too concerned with their perception instead of my truth. I deleted draft after draft until my laptop screen was blank, and the clock showed 3 a.m, and the San Diego streets were quiet, except for distant sirens and the eternal ocean. Finally, I gave up, closed the laptop, walked to my window, and stared at the harbor lights reflecting on dark water. Words won't matter, I whispered to my reflection in the glass. They'll see. That's enough. They'll see me finally for who I actually am, instead of who they needed me to be. And that's worth more than any speech. The woman staring back at me looked nothing like the girl who'd walked out of Beverly Hills 12 years ago. Her eyes were steady, her shoulders were straight. She'd built an empire from a motel job, and $500,000. She'd survived loneliness and doubt, and every voice that said she'd fail. She'd proven that success could be ethical, that business could be humane, that you could build something meaningful without sacrificing your soul. She'd done more than survive. She'd thrived. But underneath the confidence, under the expensive clothes, and the accolades, and the net worth that kept climbing, she was still that 22-year-old girl who'd wanted her father to be proud, who'd wanted her mother to defend her, who'd wanted to belong somewhere without losing herself, who'd wanted love without conditions. Some wounds don't heal. They just become part of the landscape. They shape you without defining you. They hurt less, but never stop hurting completely. And maybe that's okay. Maybe healing doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe it just means learning to carry the weight with grace. I went to bed finally at 4 a.m., slept for 2 hours, woke up with my alarm, feeling exhausted and exhilarated and terrified and ready. Today, I'd walk back into my past. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and keep building my future. Both things could be true. Both things were necessary. Spring at Stanford felt like a memory I'd tried to forget but couldn't quite erase. Red brick buildings glowing in afternoon sunlight. Sprawling lawns where students studied in small groups, their futures stretching before them like possibilities instead of prisons. The particular atmosphere of expensive education and unlimited potential of young people who'd never been told they couldn't do something. I'd been one of them once before I'd understood the cost of admission. The Rolls-Royce turned the corner slowly, silver gleaming under California sun like something from another world. I'd rented it for the day along with 2 security guards, both women I'd hired specifically for this because I wanted to feel safe, not intimidating. Professional, silent understanding without asking why a businesswoman needed this level of protection for an academic ceremony. "Ready?" Marissa, the lead security, asked as we approached the main hall. She'd positioned herself to see my face in the rearview mirror, reading my expression for signs of panic or uncertainty. I wasn't ready. Would never be ready. But I nodded anyway, smoothing the white pearl jacket Vivian had given me, checking my reflection one more time in the tinted window. I looked like success, like power tempered with grace, like someone who'd earned every dollar and every accolade without compromising her values. Exactly what I'd intended. The car stopped in front of the main entrance. The door opened. I took a breath and stepped out into blinding light. Flash after flash after flash exploded around me. Journalists positioned like they'd been waiting, cameras ready, questions prepared. Someone had tipped them off, made sure this arrival would be documented, would become part of the narrative. Probably Hannah, I realized. Making sure everyone would see, making sure my return was recorded for history. Questions shouted from every direction, a wall of noise I couldn't parse into individual words. Just sound, just attention, just proof that I existed in a way that mattered, that I'd become someone worth photographing, someone whose presence was news. I walked toward the entrance, my white suit jacket catching the light, exactly the way Vivian had promised it would. Each step felt like crossing a battlefield where the war was already over, but the wounded were still counting their losses. My heels clicked against the brick pathway with authority, with certainty, with the particular sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The courtyard had gone quiet. Hundreds of people turning to watch, conversations stopping mid-sentence, movement freezing like someone had pressed pause on the entire scene. I felt their eyes on me, curious, assessing, impressed. Some probably recognized me from magazine covers, from business articles, from the viral quotes that had circulated online. Others just recognized power. When they saw it, recognized someone who commanded attention without demanding it. Inside the auditorium blazed with warmth and achievement. Banners hung from the ceiling celebrating innovation and entrepreneurship. Seats filled with faces I didn't know, and a few I remembered vaguely from my brief time as a student here. Alumni who'd gone on to build companies and fortunes, professors who'd taught the classes I'd dropped, business leaders who'd once looked through me like I was glass, and now watched me with interest. And then, I saw them. Front row left side, exactly where they'd been placed. My father in a dark suit, his face stone, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair like he needed something to hold on to. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, the weight of his legal troubles visible in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. My mother beside him wearing a cream silk blouse and pearls, her hands clutching a handkerchief in her lap. Her eyes already wet with tears she was trying not to shed. She looked nervous, hopeful, terrified, proud, all at once. The complex expression of a mother watching her daughter succeed after years of absence, uncertain whether she had the right to claim any part of that success. Hannah on the end standing now, her face breaking into a smile that was part hope and part fear and part pure pride. She was wearing navy blue, professional and polished looking, nothing like the 17-year-old girl I'd left behind. She'd become someone confident, someone brave, someone I was proud to call my sister. Our eyes met across the auditorium. She nodded once. "You've got this. I believe in you. I'm here for you." I nodded back. "Thank you for nominating me, for speaking up, for finding your courage, for being here." The MC stepped to the podium, his voice amplified through the hall, professional and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, faculty members, and students, welcome to the annual Entrepreneurship Forum. Today, we honor extraordinary achievement in sustainable business practices and ethical innovation." I found my seat on the side stage, my heart hammering so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. From here, I had a perfect view of the audience of my family in the front row, of Hannah watching me with pride, and my mother watching me with regret, and my father watching me with something I couldn't quite identify. Not pride. Not quite. Something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that I'd become exactly what he'd wanted, just not in the way he'd expected. "Our guest of honor today," the MC continued, began her journey not with privilege, though she was born to it, but with courage. At 22 years old, she walked away from a guaranteed fortune to build something authentic. She turned an initial investment of $500,000 into a $50 million enterprise. She's redefined luxury hospitality for a generation that values peace over opulence. She's built an empire on ethics, in an industry often lacking them. She's employed hundreds of people at living wages with full benefits. She's partnered with local communities instead of displacing them. She's proven that success and integrity aren't opposites. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. She's a testament to what happens when talent meets determination, when vision meets values, when someone chooses themselves without becoming selfish. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce someone who needs no introduction, but I'll give one anyway. Hannah stepped onto the stage. I hadn't expected that. My hands gripped the chair arms, my breathing quickening with surprise and emotion. She took the microphone poised and professional-looking, nothing like the terrified teenager I'd left behind. She'd grown into herself, found her strength become someone remarkable. Sometimes, she said, her voice clear and strong and carrying perfectly through the auditorium. The ones we cast aside become the ones who light the way. My sister taught me that. She taught me that silence isn't the same as peace, that leaving isn't the same as failing, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who love you but don't understand you. The crowd remained absolutely silent, hundreds of people holding their breath. Madison Clarke didn't need our permission to succeed. She didn't need our approval or our blessing or our support. She did it anyway. She built something beautiful and meaningful and successful without any help from the people who should have helped her most. Her voice cracked slightly but held strong. But she's giving us permission to be proud anyway, and I am so impossibly proud of her courage, of her integrity, of the woman she became when she stopped trying to be the woman we wanted her to be. She stepped back, her eyes meeting mine across the stage, shining with tears and pride and love. The MC returned. Please welcome our guest of honor, Chair of the National Entrepreneurship Forum, Madison Clarke. The applause started like a wave, building slowly, then crashing over everything. My mother stood first, clapping through tears that streamed down her face unchecked. Then Hannah, still on stage, clapping and smiling and crying simultaneously. Then the rest of the audience, hundreds of people rising to their feet. The sound filling the auditorium like thunder, like validation, like 12 years of doubt being answered all at once. Even my father stood slowly, his face unreadable, but his hands moving, clapping with everyone else because not clapping would have made his absence of pride too obvious. I stood, my legs shaking but holding, and walked across the stage toward the podium, toward the microphone, toward the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it for 12 years. 12 years ago, they buried my name, called me a disgrace, told me I'd fail, predicted I'd come crawling back within a year. Today they spelled it in lights, called me successful, asked me to speak, recognized me as someone worth honoring. The difference felt like vindication and victory, and something sadder too. The knowledge that I'd been right, but that being right had cost me years of relationship, years of family, years of belonging. But I'd survived, more than survived, and that had to be enough. The spotlight found me immediately warm and bright, isolating me from everything else. I stood at the podium, hands resting on the wood, looking out at hundreds of faces watching me with interest, respect, curiosity, expectation. And front row left side, my family, watching me in a way they never had before. Really seeing me instead of seeing their disappointment, or their expectations, or their version of who I should be. I didn't use notes. Couldn't. Every draft had sounded wrong because I'd been trying to say what they wanted to hear instead of what I needed to say. So I'd thrown them all away and decided to speak from the broken places instead, from the scars that had healed wrong and the wounds that never quite closed. I was 22 years old the last time I sat at a dinner table with my family. I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. My father told me that if I walked away from the Clarke legacy, I'd be walking away from my name, that the Clarke name wouldn't be mine anymore, that I'd be nobody. You could hear breathing in that room. That's how quiet it was, hundreds of people barely breathing, afraid to miss a single word. I believed him. For a long time, I thought I'd lost something that night. My identity, my worth, my place in the world. I paused, looked directly at my father. His face remained stone, but his jaw was tight, his knuckles white where they gripped the armrest. I was wrong. I didn't lose my name. I finally found it. My mother's hand covered her mouth, muffling a sound that might have been a sob. Hannah smiled through tears, encouraging me to continue. You see, the Clarke name was never mine to lose. It was theirs, built by their choices, their work, their successes and failures, my grandfather's sweat, my father's ambition, my family's legacy, but not mine. Walking away didn't strip me of anything. It freed me to build something I could actually call my own, something that reflected my values instead of inherited expectations. I looked at Vivian in the back row. She nodded once, permission to keep going. Pride in her expression. I want to talk about revenge, I said, and the room shifted. People leaning forward, sensing the story was about to go somewhere unexpected. Because that's what everyone wants to know, isn't it? Did I build the lighthouse collection to prove my father wrong? Did I succeed just to show them I could? Was every achievement a middle finger to the people who said I'd fail? I shook my head slowly, meaning it, feeling the truth of it in my bones. No, revenge is exhausting. It ties you to the people who hurt you. It makes your success about them instead of you. It means you're still letting them define your worth just in opposition instead of agreement. I smiled, but it was sad, weighted with understanding that had taken years to acquire. I didn't succeed because of them. I succeeded despite the part of me that still wanted their approval, despite the voice in my head that sounded like my father telling me I was making a mistake, despite the loneliness of building something without family to celebrate with. My father's face finally changed. Something flickered there, recognition maybe, or regret. The understanding that I'd spent 12 years fighting against his voice in my head, and that voice had been his final form of control over me. You don't need revenge to win, I said, my voice growing stronger. You just need to keep walking until they have no choice but to look up. You just need to build something so undeniably good that it speaks for itself. You just need to choose yourself over and over until choosing yourself becomes natural instead of terrifying. The applause came slow this time, building gradually like a tide. People stood first, a few, then dozens, then everyone. The noise filled the auditorium like an embrace, like acceptance, like validation. I stood there letting it wash over me, understanding finally what Vivian had meant all those years ago. This wasn't about proving them wrong. This was about proving myself right. Right that I could walk away and survive. Right that I could build something real and meaningful. Right that I could be Madison Clarke on my own terms, defined by my choices, instead of their expectations. The ovation continued, hands clapping in rhythm, now a heartbeat of affirmation. I looked at my father one last time. His hands were in his lap. He wasn't clapping, but he was staring at me like he'd never quite seen me before, like he'd just realized exactly what he'd lost that night at dinner, like he understood finally that the daughter he'd discarded had been worth keeping. My mother stood and clapped, her face wet with tears, her expression some complicated mix of pride and regret and love and grief. She was celebrating and mourning simultaneously, happy for who I'd become, but sad about what it had cost us both. Hannah clapped the loudest, her joy uncomplicated and pure proud of her sister without reservation or qualification. And Vivian in the back row clapped quietly with a smile that said, I told you so, without needing words. For the first time they saw the woman I became without them. Not despite them exactly, but separate from them, independent of their approval or disappointment, whole on my own terms. And maybe that was the real victory. Not that they finally recognized my success, but that I no longer needed them to. The applause faded eventually, like all applause does, returning to silence and normal breathing, and the mundane transition back to regular life. But the moment stayed crystallized in my memory, like amber preserving this feeling of being seen and valued and honored. I stepped away from the podium, the ceremony transitioning to closing remarks and networking, and the ordinary business of professional gatherings. But nothing felt ordinary. Everything felt significant, weighted with meaning, like a chapter ending and a new one beginning in the same breath. The ceremony ended with handshakes and photographs, and congratulations from people whose names I'd forget by tomorrow, but whose validation still felt good in the moment. Business leaders wanting to network, professors expressing pride in an alumna who'd made something of herself despite the odds. Students asking for advice about starting their own ventures. I smiled and thanked them. Played the role of successful entrepreneur with practiced ease, said the right things about persistence and vision, and believing in yourself. All of it true, none of it quite capturing the messiness of actually building something from nothing. The nights of doubt and loneliness. The constant fear that you'd made a terrible mistake and ruined your life for no good reason. Success looks clean from the outside. From the inside, it's always messy. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything gold, that particular California light that makes the ordinary look extraordinary. The Stanford arches glowed like they were lit from within, Students walked past in small groups, laughing about things that felt impossibly far from my current reality, existing in a world where family drama was just drama, not trauma. Madison? I turned. Hannah ran across the courtyard, her heels clicking against the brick professional, and poised, transforming into excited and emotional in seconds. She threw her arms around me and I held her tight, feeling the 12 years of distance collapse into this one moment of connection. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered into my shoulder, her voice breaking. "So impossibly proud. You were everything I needed you to be up there. I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long." She continued, pulling back to look at me with wet eyes. "I should have defended you when you left, should have called you, should have chosen you over him." "You didn't stay silent," I said gently, meaning it. "You waited for the right time to speak. You gathered evidence. You found your courage when it would actually matter, when your voice could change things. That's not silence, Hannah. That's strategy. That's wisdom." She laughed, but it came out like a sob. "I was so scared. Every day for 12 years I was terrified. Of him, of being alone, of making the wrong choice. And then I found those files and realized the wrong choice was staying quiet. You did the right thing. You're doing the right thing. And I'm proud of you too." Jason appeared, grinning like he'd just won the lottery, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Next time, warn me before the emotional fireworks." Yeah, I almost cried up there. Me. I don't cry. I have a reputation. "You did cry," Hannah said, smiling through her own tears. "Allergies," he insisted, but he was laughing. "Terrible allergies. Very sudden. Completely unrelated to Madison's speech." We stood together in the golden light, 3 people who'd built something good together, who'd chosen integrity over expediency, who'd proven that success didn't require sacrificing your soul. Vivian approached slowly, elegant and composed as always, in her cream suit that never seemed to accumulate dust or wrinkles or any evidence of existing in the real world. She looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who's finally understood the lesson. The difficult lesson that takes years to learn. "You did it," she said simply. No embellishment needed. "Did what? Exactly what I told you that day in the cafe. You stopped surviving. You started building. And you did it for yourself, not for them. That's what makes it matter. That's what makes it real." I hugged her, this woman who'd bet on me when no one else would, who'd seen potential in a motel desk clerk and turned it into possibility, who'd been more family to me than my actual family had been for 12 years. "Thank you," I said, "for everything, for believing in me, for investing in me, for never trying to control me or own me or shape me into someone I wasn't. Thank me by keeping going, by building the next thing, by never letting them make you small again, by showing other people that walking away is possible, that starting over is survivable, that success can be ethical." My mother appeared in my peripheral vision, walking slowly across the courtyard like she was afraid I'd disappear if she moved too fast. Like maybe this was a dream and sudden movement would wake her up. She'd changed in 12 years, aged in ways that weren't just physical. More gray in her hair, lines around her eyes, but something else too, something like peace. Like the weight she'd been carrying was finally lighter. "Madison," she said. And my name sounded different in her voice now. Not an accusation or a disappointment. Just my name. Simple and honest. "Mom." "I don't have the right words," she began, but I shook my head gently. "You wrote them. In that article. In your op-ed. That's enough. That's more than enough." Can it ever be enough?" Her voice trembled. "I failed you for 12 years. I chose him over you. I stayed silent when you needed someone to speak. How do I make up for that?" "You don't make up for it. You just keep doing better. You keep being honest. You keep choosing courage over comfort. You show up and you tell the truth, and you let that be enough." We embraced quietly. No dramatic tears or declarations. Just 2 women trying to find their way back to each other across years of hurt and silence. Understanding that some bridges take time to rebuild, that some relationships require patience and forgiveness, and the willingness to start over. "He watched you up there," she said softly, still holding me. "Your father. He watched you. and for the first time, I think he understood what he lost. I saw it in his face. The realization, the regret, too late to matter, but there nonetheless. I hope so, I said honestly. Not because I need him to hurt, but because maybe then he'll understand why I left. Maybe then he'll know that love without respect isn't really love. It's just control wearing love's mask. She nodded, kissed my cheek, and walked away. Sometimes love looks like letting go. Sometimes forgiveness looks like distance. Sometimes peace looks like a mother and daughter who will never be what they were, but might someday become something new and honest and better. The Rolls-Royce waited at the curb, silver gleaming in the afternoon light, looking ridiculously ostentatious and absolutely perfect. My bodyguards stood by the doors, patient and professional understanding, without being told that this moment needed space. The setting sun turned everything amber and gold, and for a moment Stanford looked like a place I might have belonged if things had been different. But things weren't different. Things were exactly as they needed to be, and I'd built something better than belonging. I'd built freedom. Jason climbed in first. Hannah hugged me one more time, her embrace fierce and full of promise. "Visit soon," she said. "Please, I'll come to San Diego. We can have dinner. We can rebuild this. It won't be what it was, but it can be something." "I'd like that," I said, meaning it. Vivian simply nodded our goodbye, not needing words. We'd built something together that went deeper than friendship or mentorship or business partnership. We'd built trust, and trust doesn't need dramatic farewells. I slid into the leather seats, and the door closed with a soft, expensive click that somehow captured the entire day. Wealth with taste, success with grace, power with purpose. Through the tinted window, I watched the Stanford arches fade into the distance. The courtyard where hundreds of people had applauded. The stage where I'd finally said everything I'd needed to say. The spot where my family had sat and watched me become someone they'd never expected. The car merged into traffic, just another vehicle, among thousands carrying just another person among millions. Except, I wasn't just another person. Not anymore. Maybe I never had been, but it had taken 12 years and a long, painful journey to believe it. I was Madison Clarke. Not Richard Clarke's daughter, though that would always be part of my story. Not the runaway heiress, though that was how the magazines would always frame it. Not the self-made CEO, though that's what the awards said. Just Madison. The woman who'd walked away when staying would have killed something essential. Who'd built an empire from nothing with help from someone who believed in her. Who'd returned not for revenge, but for peace. Who'd proven that success could be ethical, that business could be humane, that you could build something beautiful without compromising your soul. The city lights began to flicker on as twilight settled over California. That magic hour when day becomes night and everything feels possible. Somewhere behind us, my family was processing what they'd seen, grappling with who I'd become, starting their own journeys toward healing or understanding, or whatever their next chapters held. Somewhere ahead. The Lighthouse Collection weighted 8 properties, and counting each one a testament to peace over perfection, to simplicity over excess, to treating people like they mattered. I closed my eyes and let the motion of the car rock me gently, feeling lighter than I'd felt in 12 years. Not because I'd proven anything to anyone, but because I'd stopped trying to. The applause was over. The cameras were off. The stage was empty. The ceremony was history. And I was free. Finally. Completely. On my own terms. Justice doesn't shout. It stands tall and lets its presence speak. Success doesn't need to scream. It just needs to arrive quietly, confident, undeniably real. And forgiveness. I was learning doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like understanding. Sometimes it looks like distance with dignity. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace over having the last word. Sometimes it looks like driving away in a silver Rolls-Royce while the sun sets on the past and rises on a future you built yourself, one difficult choice at a time. One brave step forward. One refusal to be small. The highway stretched ahead, and beyond it, the Pacific Ocean. Waiting with its eternal rhythm reminding me, that some things endure regardless of human drama. The waves would keep crashing. The sun would keep setting. Life would keep moving forward. And so would I.